Welcome back to Succession Stories. It's not often that I have someone coming on the show to absolutely talk about succession with an expertise and stories and an engagement quite like my guest, Albert. I am so excited to be with you today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Laurie. So excited to be here.
Let's start with the question. You're an author with a new book, and you're going to
Yep.
tell us all about it. And the
Yeah.
question right out of the gates is you've put so much time and energy into writing this book about succession.
Mhm.
What has been one of the biggest surprises?
So I would say at this point, it's been the extent to which successors are kind of bringing a knife to a gunfight. If I was, and what really sparked writing the book in the first place was I was concerned for folks that I was coaching that were successors who just didn't have the resources to really understand or engage at, I think, the level that they needed to be as successful as they possibly could be. So after searching a whole lot of places for, I didn't care if it was blog posts or books or whatever that would help the successor side of things, I just realized there weren't enough resources out there and started doing interviews. And next thing I know, I was writing a chapter or two.
So there's a couple of main characters, if we can put avatars out there, because you're using these words, and I thought we could just establish a little bit
Yeah.
of vocabulary. So what are the key words here? We've got a predecessor
Yep.
and we've got a successor. So tell me
Yep.
about those groups.
Yeah. So in large part, what I was trying to understand and help successors understand, the people who are taking, the baton, the reins, pick your favorite metaphor. Those folks are largely at this point, I would say between the ages of 30 and 45, by and large, who are being tapped as the next generation leaders in their organizations. And what I think is super interesting, if you look at the demographics, predecessors are largely the baby boomers who are walking out the door. In fact, from 2024 to 2027, we're in peak boomers. So we've all heard the 10,000, we've heard that statistic a million times. 10,000 baby boomers are reaching retirement age every day. That is true by about 1,500 more a day through 2024 through 2027. So largely boomers who are kind of stepping out of their roles. And they're handing, it's interesting, off to largely millennial aged workers. That Gen X group is being skipped over in a lot of ways. That is just part of, I think, why this is such a challenging succession process that we're navigating in so many different organizations.
So fascinating. When I was reading the early version of your book, which I appreciated, you had shared the manuscript with me, and I am one of the people who wrote a blurb in support of your
Yeah, for
book, and
sure.
I'm so excited to be part of this launch with you. Um, as a Gen Xer, I
Hmm.
was relating to those pieces of knowledge and insight that you were sharing about this sort of skip generation, because I
Yeah,
sort of saw it unfolding 10, 20 years ago. I mean, and now
sure.
you have a position now in the market where you've got boomers saying, I don't have kids. I don't have anyone in the business necessarily that's going to buy this business. Who's out there that might want to buy it? And those
Yep.
could be Gen Xers. They could
Hmm.
be, right?
Hmm.
Or they could be the millennials. And from a buyer standpoint, who are looking to acquire businesses on their own, we'll call them acquisition entrepreneurs. There's
Sure.
definitely activity there, way more activity than I've seen, over
Yep.
the decades. So this is really, really exciting as an opportunity. The other part of it, I think, that's exciting is on the internal sense of succession when it comes to family, to
Yep.
recognize that Gen Xers obviously play a pretty important role if they're part of the family, but the next gen beyond is someone we want to listen to.
Yeah.
And let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about the millennials who
Sure.
are now being asked, hey, we want to hear from you. Teach
Yeah.
us. What
Yeah.
was some of the takeaways as you were going through all your conversations around the millennials stepping up as mentors?
For sure. So a couple of dynamics I think are just interesting and surprised me as I was working through it. I did a lot of work with family businesses because obviously the number of succession challenges are directly going to be family, closely held family-owned businesses. But the problems or the challenges that those organizations faced were identical to companies that weren't, or organizations who weren't. And it was true across nonprofit succession challenges where people were, we have executive directors who've sat in that seat for 30 years or whatever and are handing off the role, to family businesses, to corporations, to other closely held businesses, that ultimately the emotional dynamics, the business dynamics may be, similar across those situations, but the emotional dynamics were what were the difference makers between a successful handoff and one that was just more challenged.
Yeah. The understanding why people are acting a certain way struck me as a very interesting perspective in the book. And I know it comes up in a couple different ways. Um, it's about being empathetic for sure,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
can you share a couple of examples or case studies,
Sure.
sorry, of
Sure. Well,
of the importance of that?
yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll start with a little bit of a provocative statement, which is I am not, um, I don't think the transaction matters that much. It matters. It is hugely important. But in the end, what I've found is the transaction is the symbol of what everybody is looking to achieve in this. And you see the best and worst of people's instincts just flat out. Now, when we look at the emotional context, there's a metaphor I use throughout the book that is wildfires. And the idea there is that there are sparks that can start a fire, and then there are the conditions on which those sparks fall. And that's the metaphor I use to help successors understand why some of those dynamics just don't work out well. And so the conditions are essentially where the predecessor's mindset is as they're thinking through the succession process and experiencing that process. And that is best defined by the 7 stages of grief. Those conditions are the stages of grief. And what we've seen out of predecessors is they're often unaware that they're in the process of grieving. They do not know that that is happening. And the primary point of challenge between predecessors and successors is that grief point. So a big part of the book is really helping successors to understand these folks are in an emotional state that you may not be aware that they are, and they may not be aware that they are, and that those different stages of grief can have a huge impact on how those interactions go.
Wow, it really does change the narrative. It feels transactional. It feels like we're all about money and we're having these conversations with our attorneys. But when you flip the script around and you understand this person has a lot of emotion, they're looking to exit with grace. How can you help them do that? Whether you are an internal successor, right, a manager or
Sure.
family, or even like we were talking about earlier, like if you're an acquisition entrepreneur and you're looking to buy this business, having that perspective will go a long way for
Yeah.
making a deal a win-win and
Yep.
enabling the owner or the predecessor to exit with grace. I mean, ultimately, I think that's a really, really important thing
Sure.
because things can go really wrong and in the deal process, and things can go right, but then they
Mhm.
can still go wrong after the deal is done, right? A
Amen.
transition is multi-stage.
Yep.
Did you address that in your book as well?
Yeah,
Like
for
from
sure.
the
So
negotiation all the way through?
yeah, so again, I kind of skip over the transaction because there are people like you. There are so many folks who know exactly how those go, and they're smarter than me. What I wanted to tackle was, okay, how are you going to manage this relationship so that you can take over, that you don't spark some wildfires, and there's some typical things that successors fall into, that can be really challenging. But managing that relationship and maintaining that relationship even well after the transaction is something I talk about. And there is research that shows that managing the relationship and maintaining a good relationship with that predecessor has a meaningful impact on the business. Because if you think about that person walking out the door, they've been an expert at what they do for a whole long time. And so the muscle that you work out when you are navigating a bunch of stuff you're just learning for the first time can atrophy. I mean, that's one of the reasons why you've been sitting in the seat. You're so good at the job, it's kind of automatic. Well, that change stuff can feel even more dramatic when you're going through something like this transition, because it's a sense of loss, and it's a sense of a fundamental shift in the way they see themselves, right? That's bottom line. And so being the successor and being able to recognize that and maintain and help provide context and dignity and give them space and all of those things are what we have seen on a consistent basis that makes the difference between a succession process that goes well and one that completely falls apart.
Yeah, full of empathy. And if we come back to, call them the owner or Gen 1 or, the person that is in the seat today that kind of doesn't want to talk about this stuff for
Hmm.
whatever reason.
Yep.
What are we observing there? Is it a avoidance? Is it an ignorance? Is it a kick the can-erance?
Yeah.
Why are these conversations being avoided by some people?
So, because people have a sense of loss and they don't necessarily understand grief, we run away from that. All of us do, right? I mean, we all struggle when we are going through a sense of loss. The other part is that most predecessors, from what we can tell, are struggling to understand the extent to which that role, that ownership, all of the things that they have as a result of that business, is part of their identity. And so there what I've referred to as sparks, right? So there's the conditions on what the sparks fall, but then there's sparks, and there are a couple that are probably worth talking about. One is this kind of idea, the prisoner's dilemma, where you have a successor and a predecessor. And if they're both playing to maximize, that can really hurt the business, right? If while on the other side, if they're playing in a way that is supportive of each other, that tends to be what works best. But even in that situation, the predecessor has more data. Another one I talk about is what I refer to as the exit iceberg, which is kind of the three things that the predecessor's navigating, whether they know it or not. And that is, what is their self-interest? So what's the interest? And that can be everything from the dollars and cents part of the transaction to, they used to get games, game tickets to Steelers or Pirates or, whatever, right? So there's that level. Then there's the identity, and that's just kind of how they see themselves and how they've defined themselves to that point. And some of that's above the surface, but some of it's below. You don't necessarily know that it's there. And then that very last piece that tends to be kind of invisible is the instinct. And it's just this gut feel that so many predecessors have built over their careers where they can just kind of lick their finger and put it in the air, and they kind of know what things look like or what direction things should go. Well, you kind of lose that when you're relearning how to be. And so that instinct can sometimes be wrong, even if it feels right. And so the interaction of those three things, and that instinct, by the way, can be everything from you want to change the logo, or you're implementing a new strategic plan, or whatever it is, something that person doesn't even know they care so much about, all of a sudden becomes something now they're very angry that you don't quite understand or respect. And those can pop out of nowhere. And to take that wildfire idea to its logical end, that can really spark an inferno. And so there are stories within the book of predecessors who have nuked their entire plans, simply because, at least in the data that I have, they misread interactions that simply weren't what they thought they were.
Is there one of those stories that stands out to you that you could
Yeah.
share?
So there's one in particular where a business owner had started the company from absolutely nothing. And within about a decade, grew it to a sizable 8-figure, value business. Was days away, and one other dynamic, had set his executive team up to really run the business without him. His goal was to go to Florida, drink a couple Coronas on his back porch, and that was about it. And he had invested a lot of time and a lot of resources into preparing that executive team. The transition happens. He names someone else CEO. There are several other executives who step in. The business hits revenue targets that were exceeding anything he had done in his history. And you could tell he was struggling through that process. And it was only about a year. They had hit every number, but he was a little concerned that there were some cultural problems, and I'll put that in air quotes, and decided that things were off track. He was about to sell the company, was days away from closing, and nuked the entire plan at the last minute. Basically fired the executive team, stepped back in as CEO, and named family to run all of those other roles that those well-prepared executives had taken over. And at this point, the business is probably worth 40% of what it was, just a couple of years ago. And when he was a bit in the confessional of the conversation, he said he couldn't see himself being retired. And he was really uncomfortable with having his name on the side of the building, but not actually doing anything with the business. It had nothing to do with the transaction. It had nothing to do with any of the stuff that was on paper. It was all his identity and his self-interest and the resources and the ego and all of those things that he just couldn't handle not being the business.
Interesting. One of the things that you and I talked about in preparation for this show today was being right or winning. And
Yeah.
sometimes those are at odds with each other. And this
Yep.
story that you shared is a little bit along those lines, but
Yeah.
tell me a little bit more about why that stands out to you thematically.
Yeah. So the hard part, I think, as you look at where millennials sit. So a couple of little demographic details worth bringing up. There's about a 7 million person gap between boomers and millennials. In other words, we're 7 million short in the Xers. So number one is just purely by data. Those millennials are going to have to step into roles more quickly than expected, right? So that's demographics. The other dynamic is they are having to help escort out a generation that has been lived to work by identity, right, their entire careers, while onboarding and coaching a generation that, I don't have perfect data on this, but I take up a wild guess that there's probably about an 8 to 15 year span of folks who either had just entered the workforce when the pandemic hit, or were in kind of late elementary school, and that entire stretch. So those folks are likely developmentally behind to get to where you would have expect college graduates going into the workforce 5 years ago, pre-pandemic, to be. And so we're sitting kind of in the middle of those two groups. We got to escort one out, we got to coach one up. And so what I think is, first, short of having to save the world from, Nazis, this is probably one of the hardest leadership challenges that we're going to have to navigate that's really happened. Again, aside from world wars. The other part is every element of that is going to take empathy. So we're going to have to be able to run and manage effectively the businesses that we're taking over from a group that's not really comfortable letting go, and onboarding a group that doesn't quite know what their careers are going to look like and didn't necessarily have the kind of developmental opportunities that they would have otherwise, because we have that 3-year goofiness of the pandemic. I think that ultimately for leaders, particularly millennial age leaders who are comfortable being adaptable, empathetic, and approaching some of that problem solving with a whole lot of intention and grace, I think those are the folks who are going to step up and are going to be effective. And my goal was hopefully A, to shed some light on that, and B, to give some guidance and ideas and thoughts to help speed that process up for those folks so they don't have to make a bunch of mistakes as they're trying to navigate both of those groups.
Yeah, absolutely. You wrote this book for a reason. You're passionate
Mhm.
about the topic. So it's probably a
Yeah.
good question for you is what's your origin story and how did you get to this point in your career where you said, I'm going to write this book and try to help
Yeah.
people?
So there are two dynamics at play. So have an entrepreneurial background. I've started a couple of companies. I've worked in the economic development space, and interestingly, in my economic development days, which now are 12 plus years ago, um, a lot of the things that we were talking about then were this kind of economic, what we now kind of call the silver tsunami, that there's going to be all of these companies that are on the sales block, right? And that if you have a layoff of 500 employees, that's front page news. If you have, 50 10-person companies or 10 5-person companies shut down, no one knows that, but it's the same impact, right? It doesn't get the same level of press. And so this has been on the table again because demographics are destiny for a long time. My time at Solutions 21 has largely been spent, at least my first 6, 7 years, working with successors and succession candidates, as well as executives, and kind of seeing the world from both sides and really wanting to help the people I was coaching with validated good ideas on how to approach it and how to be patient. Now, I could stop there if I were dishonest, but then there's another part of it, which is our CEO's peak boomer. So he was born in 1959. He turned 65 in 2024. So our business is also going through transition and trying to understand what his mindset is and where his decisions are coming from. And he was kind enough to be vulnerable. He wrote the foreword for the book. He was kind enough to be a little bit vulnerable about that experience. And bottom line, I think if we are all approaching this with a recognition that this is just a really emotionally challenging and taxing time for everybody, it brings down the temperature on what are going to inevitably be some really hard conversations.
Yeah. You're creating the space for it, your book, which we should say the name of it. I know I
Ah,
mentioned it in the introduction, but we haven't talked about the title, which is
sure.
Succeeding. This is
Yep.
about success. And of course,
Yep.
this show is Succession Stories. It's about
Yep.
succeeding in succession, which, as we know, is hard to say and hard to do.
Yep.
Um, and let's just sort of pause there. I mean, there's two flavors of succession that we talk a lot about in this show. One is leadership succession, and one is ownership succession.
Yep.
I think it's probably fair to categorize largely. This is a book for leadership successors. Is that
For sure.
fair?
Yeah, for sure. No doubt.
No
No
doubt.
doubt.
So we
I
want to
mean,
reach as many of them as possible. We want them to go out and buy this book because if they're someone who, if they're a millennial and they can see themselves growing in capacity in their current organization or in a different organization, it's a great read for them, is it not?
yeah, for sure. I mean, the audience isn't so specific to people who are just, getting to own the business. It is much more extensive than that. And, just trying to help people to understand, like, folks walking out the door have a lot to give. And if we manage that process well, they will be happier. We will have access to some really great perspective and talent. And I think we all will be able to kind of look at ourselves in the mirror a little easier than it can be sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question, which you kind of already answered, but I'll give you an opportunity to add on to it. The question is, we've talked about so much, right?
Mhm.
There's so much in the book. We want to encourage everybody to get their copy
Sure.
and learn from it. And if you were going to dog ear a couple of sections and say these are super actionable,
Yeah.
these are the must read sections or your favorite standout sections to get people to really roll up their sleeves and take action on something, what
Yeah.
are they?
Well, I'll tell you, maybe I'll answer it a little bit differently. There are 7 chapters, and it was written to skim. So I am not someone who can typically digest a 350-page business book, and so I certainly understand that folks don't have infinite time and energy. So I try to make it so that you could theoretically skim through the key points and get through it in about 45 minutes, in the worst case. The first chapter is just about the demographics and why it's happening. The second one is about all the things that we're transitioning. I think one of the hard parts is a lot of successors just don't even know what that means. And because many predecessors have been the owner and have been the governance and have managed the business and have led it and have been the brand, those are things that as a successor I may not even be aware of. Chapter 3 is all about the predecessor and the emotions and all of the stuff that goes along with it, including some archetypes of just the type of behaviors those folks might do. So if that's something that you're like, why do I feel crazy? Chapter 3 really helps answer that question. Chapter 4 is about the succession process, and it's really about kind of this reality show kind of tendency that we're starting to see, that if there are more than one potential successors, that we've allowed this kind of reality show genre to infect the way that we select those folks. And just to give some heads up as to what that process may look like if you're experiencing that. Chapter 5 is all about, here are the dumb things you do, frankly, as a successor, and some of the leadership mistakes you might make. And so if you're really focused on how do I improve my leadership capability, the chapter 5 helps unearth where there could be gaps. And 6 is about, okay, what do I do now? And then 7 wraps it all up with just, here's some process. Here's some things that if you were to approach the predecessor or you were to execute yourself, they're simple tools, but help you to create certainty around what that process looks like.
Awesome. Awesome. I think that this is a book that's really going to help a lot of people win, but win in a way that everyone's winning and have more empathy for the predecessors who have helped pave the way in a really valuable mentoring manner, business manner, etc. So if people want to find you, Albert, to learn more, find the
Yep.
book, what's a good way to connect?
The layup way will be succeedingbook.com. So you go there, it'll redirect somewhere. We're still figuring out how the website stuff is going to work. Officially will be available toward the end of September on Amazon. And yeah, happy to help anybody. There's one element that I throw at the end of the book. I tend to make a joke that when we work with our clients, even if they don't want to work with us anymore, they're candidates who still need help. I joke we're a little bit like Olive Garden once you hear your family. So I kind of feel that way about anyone who, is struggling through this. I'm more than happy to answer questions and be maybe even a shoulder to cry on when that might be necessary.
For a lot of people, they're going, "Oh, wow, I can see that being pretty valuable."
Yeah,
And others going, "No, thanks, I'm good."
yeah,
And
no doubt,
everybody
no
in
doubt.
between. And so that's the whole point, right? We're trying to meet people where they are, and you're available as a resource. So thank you for that.
Yep.
I love to ask people for their favorite quote. And in your case, because you're an author, you can quote yourself, but I'll ask you, yeah, tell me your favorite quote about entrepreneurship, or what's something you'd like to share.
Sure. So this one came out of my work reading the book or writing the book. And I've been asked a little bit like, what is the one thing, the one quote, if I were to summarize the entire, 200 and some pages into one thing? Bobby Bowden, who is the former head football coach at Florida State, was notoriously in that role a long time. He was an old guy before he finally stepped down. And he'd get pestered by the press about whether he was ever going to retire and all those kind of things. And at one point, he kind of got a little upset and he said, after you retire, there's only one big event left, and I ain't ready for that. And I think that summarizes really ultimately what this challenge is for folks, and particularly for predecessors, what they're experiencing.
Awesome. Awesome. Albert, thank you so much for coming on Succession Stories.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Laurie. Take care.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this show, if you laughed, if you learned something, then why not share it with a friend? Also, we would super love it if you would leave us a rating and review. Go to your favorite podcast player, like Apple Podcasts, for example, and leave us a rating and review. We really love to hear your feedback. If you have questions, reach out to me anytime, Laurie at btsherpa.com. And also check us out on our YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe and follow us at the Business Transition Sherpa on YouTube. You'll catch all the Succession Stories episodes and be watching our new podcast, our new sister show called The Entrepreneur Gene. So tune in next time to Succession Stories for all your favorite episodes. We look forward to it. Take care. Thanks again, Albert.
Thank you.